Chapter 15. Natives Help. In an instant, the whole Emerson group dropped to the floor of the bus. Would the native warriors try to break in upon them? "This is terrible," came Bessa's muffled wail. The Americans could hear Batubu calling out in Swahili to the oncoming men. There was a long conversation, which did not sound hostile to Nancy. In fact, she heard a couple of the spearmen laugh. Cautiously, she raised her head and looked out the window. The tribesmen stood with their spears pointed toward the ground and did not appear at all menacing now. Finally, Nancy stood up and spoke to Batubu. "Everything is all right," he said. "No danger." Somewhat sheepishly, the young people got up from the floor and took their seats. Batubu explained that these men were stalking a roving lioness. She was reported to have killed a child in one of the villages. "How horrible!" Bess exclaimed. Batubu nodded. "These men were amused that you thought they meant to harm you." "It wasn't so funny," Bess complained. Nancy asked the guide to find out if the natives knew or had heard of Tazam. He questioned the men, then translated the answer. A year ago, a man dragged himself into their tribe's village. He had been mauled by a lioness, but had survived the attack. "Did they find out who he was?" George asked. Batubu shook his head. The man had lost his memory. He had developed fever, and it took a long time for the medicine man to make him well. After a while, his body was all right, but he could not remember who he was or where he came from. "Is he still at their village?" Nancy queried. Batubu questioned the natives, but the answer was no. The stranger had disappeared one night, and they had no idea where he had gone. Nancy and her friends were dismayed and alarmed to hear this. If the man was Tazam, there was no telling where he might have wandered. He might even have lost his life. In any case, it would account for his never having communicated with his sister or Mr. Foster's agency. George said in disappointment, "Just when we were getting within reach of solving the mystery, it slips right through our fingers." Nancy continued to ask questions, hoping to elicit some clue to Tazam's whereabouts. She learned that several times, in somewhat lucid moments, Tazam had said in Swahili, "I must get to Mombasa and report those thieves to the police." "What do you think he meant?" Dave queried. "Something to do with the spider, Sapphire?" Nancy requested Batubu to ask the tribesmen if Tazam had carried any gems with him. No, he had nothing in his pockets and no identification. Bert spoke up. "I doubt that we can learn any more. Don't you think we should start back for Nairobi?" Batubu nodded, but when he told this to the spearmen, they objected. The guide translated that the men insisted the visitors come to their village for a meal and a ceremonial dance. "I am afraid you cannot deny them this pleasure," Batubu said. The natives started their trek to the village, and the bus followed slowly. No one saw any lions, but Batubu pointed out graceful elands and kudus. They resembled American deer, but their horns were quite different. Those of the elands were long and straight and pointed slightly backwards. The kudus rose straight up from the forehead and curved in such a way that from a distance they resembled snakes. Suddenly, Batubu stopped the bus. "Look," he said, pointing toward a tree-shaded area. "There's a family of hyrax. In Africa, we call them dassies." "Aren't they cute?" Bess exclaimed. "Are they some kind of rabbit?" "No," Batubu replied. "If you will look closely, you will see that they have no tails. People used to think that they belonged to the rat family, but scientists made a study of their bodies and say their nearest relatives are the elephants. Hard to believe, said Bert. Think of a rabbit-sized elephant. The small dark brown animals were sunning themselves on an outcropping of rocks. 3 babies were hopping about their mother. Batubu explained that they were among the most interesting African animals. The babies start walking around within a few minutes of their birth, and after the first day, they're on their own. They return to the mother only long enough to be fed, but they start eating greens very quickly. Batubu drove on, but continued to talk about the dassies. There is an amusing folk tale about these little animals. It was said that in the days when the earth was first formed and animals were being put on it, the weather was cold and rainy. When all the animals were called to a certain spot to be given tails, the dassie did not want to go. As other kinds passed him, he begged them to bring him back a tail. Nancy laughed, but none of them did. That is right, Batubu answered. And so, to this day, they have no tails that they can use to switch flies. Everyone in the bus thanked him for relating the charming little legend, then looked out the windows. They were approaching a village of grass-roofed huts. The small homes were built in a semicircle. The spearmen called out to some of the villagers, and men of all ages and women and children came running from the huts. When the visitors were announced, some of the natives hastened back inside. They are putting on their ceremonial dress, Batubu said. The visitors got out of the bus and were asked to sit on the ground. The meal would soon be served to them. It was not long in arriving, and consisted of wildebeest stew and mealies, a sort of coarse cornmeal mush. Bess looked askance as her bowl was heaped with the steaming stew and the mealies put on top of it. Nancy and George were amused by the expression on her face. For once, Bess was not saying, "This looks delicious." Nancy was the first one to dip her crude wooden spoon into the food. She announced that it was delicious, although salt-free and rather flat. Everyone was hungry, and soon all the bowls were empty. The handsome native children smiled shyly as they served wild grapes for dessert. The fruit was sweet and tasty. In a few moments, several men appeared, drums hanging from their shoulders. They stood in front of the guests, then began swaying left and right as they beat on the instruments. There were several different songs. With some, the men moved forward and backward. With others, they remained in a kneeling posture. Presently, they laid their drums on the ground. They sat down and beat upon them softly as they began to sing the next song. Startled, Nancy sat upright. It was the tune she had learned from Madame Lilia Buluaya. Unconsciously, she began to hum it, then sang the words with the men. When the dance was over, the men stood up. A tribesman, whom Batubu said was the chief, came over to Nancy. He said something to her in Swahili, which Batubu translated. "We are charmed that you know our song. Please stand up with the dancers and sing it." Nancy blushed a deep red. "Oh, I couldn't. I don't know it that well," she protested. The natives would not take no for an answer. The chief took her hand and raised Nancy from the ground, then escorted her forward to the dancing group. To herself, Nancy was saying, "Oh, I hope I don't muff this. I suppose it is the least I can do in return for the meal." The drums began to beat softly, and the men hummed just above a whisper. This was Nancy's cue. Raising her voice, she sang the lovely lullaby just as Madame Buluaya had taught her. At the end, the natives were enthusiastic. They beat on the drums, stamped on the ground, and shouted their applause. Nancy bowed several times, then sat down with her friends. "That was great," Ned praised her. "I expect they will make you a princess of this tribe." Nancy's eyes twinkled. "And have me become one of the chief's wives?" Then she became serious. She knew that while tribal customs were kept, the men, women, and children were becoming more civilized and educated all the time, and polygamy was fast becoming a thing of the past. When the entertainment was over, Nancy and her friends stood up and asked Batubu to thank the chief for the friendly hospitality and tell him it was an experience they would never forget. The leader grinned broadly and hoped they would all come again. They would always be most welcome. The visitors returned to the bus and drove back to Nairobi. They discussed the new clue to Tazam and asked Nancy what she intended to do next to solve the mystery about him. It's only a hunch, but I have a strong feeling that he's still alive, and I'm going to work harder than ever to find him. In Mombasa? Ned asked. Probably. Now I can hardly wait to get there. She and her friends reached the hotel in time for a very late dinner. As she stopped at the desk to get her key, the clerk said that 2 men, one older than the other, had called on her that morning. They wouldn't leave their names, but said they were most eager to get in touch with you, he reported. What time were they here? Nancy asked. The clerk said he did not remember exactly, but that it was before the rest of the Emerson group had left for Mombasa. The men seemed very annoyed to learn that you were not here. Nancy asked for a description of the 2 men. It was possible they were Jahan and Don. From what little the clerk could remember, however, it was hard to tell. One of the men mumbled something about having to wait all day for you to return, the clerk said. Oh, I forgot to mention that they'll be back this evening. Deep in thought, Nancy walked to the elevator, where her friends were waiting for her. On the way upstairs, she told them what she had just learned. I don't like this, Ned commented. Nancy, please don't see those men alone. I'll stick around and make sure that you're safe. And I'll certainly be glad to have you, Nancy smiled. It was decided they would not spend much time dressing, as everyone was hungry. Besides, the dining room would soon close. They hurried and met downstairs. The young people had just finished dinner when one of the hotel boys handed Nancy a small silver platter. On it lay a note signed by the desk clerk. It read, Misters Brown and Ross, who came earlier today to see you, are waiting in the lobby. As Nancy rose from the table, her heart began to beat a little faster at the thought of what might lie ahead of her. End of chapter 15.